intersections, VPC is super important. Highly recommend that you learn what all the components are and how that works when you're building a VPC, because as you do that, you'll learn the different security pieces that are involved, and we're going to talk about those kind of next. So with respect to organization, security, network isolation, and traffic direction, you want to know how to build subnets, how they work, what are you allocating when you're allocating a subnet. You want to know the security features of VPCs, specifically around security groups for securing instances, and network access control lists, which are used to secure whole subnets, and then the differences between how they operate. They're both firewalls, but one is at the instance level, one is at the subnet level, and there's some idiosyncrasies about them. You want to know how to access your VPC, whether it's through an internet gateway or a virtual private gateway. You may need to know what a NAT is, network address translation instance or gateway, and how that kind of plays in specifically around private subnets. And you have to know how that traffic works between private subnets, between public subnets, and the internet, so knowing routes and route tables. So these are all features of VPC. So again, walking through building a VPC is highly recommended. So specifically with subnets, just knowing that there are subdivisions of the VPC's network. This also comes into that that idea of IP address ranges, and then how subnets differ if you build it as a public subnet or a private subnet. Having a route to an internet gateway, that kind of piece is involved in there. There's a question, does the test cover bastion instances and NAT gateways? Not specifically, because those are constructs that you have to build, or rather are optional in the environment. Knowing what they are is important, but not necessarily how to build a NAT instance. Okay. This is the breakdown between security groups and network access control lists. So security groups and network access control lists are network firewalls, or they do restrict access, but they act slightly differently. For example, security groups are allow only, whereas network access control lists are allow or deny. Security groups are stateful in that if I allow traffic in, the response traffic is automatically allowed out, whereas with an network access control list, I have to explicitly allow both a rule for inbound and outbound traffic. Stateful, that's stateful versus stateless. Security groups are related to instances. Network access control lists are applied to subnets. I think that's really the big point in here. Yeah. George, I'm not sure if that question is for me or for Devon, but no problem. Okay, let's keep moving here. With respect to internet gateways, virtual private gateways, and direct connect, this is really just talking about the different ways to get traffic in and out of a VPC. So knowing what those different pieces are. Internet gateway is if you have a public subnet and you want it to talk to the internet or have the internet talk to it, you have to have an internet gateway. Virtual private gateway, whenever you see that, the right word to pop into your head is VPN. You're using VPN to go from on-premises to the AWS VPC. With Direct Connect, just knowing the existence of Direct Connect is really the majority case in here. You don't need to know the actual implementation and how that works. It's essentially you're bypassing the regular internet to get into your VPC, and you have to do that through a Direct Connect partner. And then VPC peering, connecting one VPC from one to another. There's a question regarding stateful versus stateless with security groups and access control lists. The example that I always give is ping. So with a security group, if you allow ping in, then the response will come back out. So if you allow ICMP in, it will come back out. With a network access control list, you have to write firewall rules that are both directions, one out, one in. There's a question, can the VPN be hardware or software? The answer is yes, you can have either. Okay, let's keep going. Routes. This is specifically around subnets and knowing how route tables work with traffic. So this is knowing, again, when you're building a VPC, this is one of those things that comes out. There's a main route table, which shows what traffic is local. And then if you want to go to anything else that is the internet or to an on-premises network via VPN or between different VPCs, you have to have routes in a route table that is custom for that subnet. So if these are things that, if any of these are terms that you're not sure about, these are the things you have to write down to study. There's a question kind of deeper about VPCs and IAM. You're not going to get a question like this on a test, the one from Christy that she popped into the chat. So I don't want to confuse the situation too much. The second piece of that, can they be secured with one IAM? That is not how IAM works. So IAM doesn't restrict traffic, it restricts API calls and actions. So that is not related to how the traffic flows. There's another question, is there a default route to each subnet? There's the main route table, which is applied to every subnet before you customize it. Okay, let's jump into a sample question. This one is a little deep, so let's look at it. You have deployed an instance in a subnet in your VPC. What steps below will allow access to Amazon S3? This one is a little tricky. I will point that out ahead of time. Feel free to read through all the answers, differentiate between them, and then pop out the right answer into the chat. Answers are coming in kind of slow on this one. It's a lot going on, right? Ooh, guessing. I like guessing. Remember, there's no penalty for guessing. I mean, other than getting it incorrect. There's not you don't get a negative score associated with a guess. Okay, are we ready? This one, like I said, is a little tricky, and that's because there's just a lot of words going on. There's a lot of different things, and they all look very, very similar. But we want to look at it in terms of getting to S3. Now remember, or recall, if you're not using an endpoint, which we're not in this, it doesn't say we're using an S3 endpoint in the VPC. A VPC endpoint lets you kind of essentially make a presence of S3 in your VPC so you can contact it without leaving your VPC. Because of the way that AWS is architected, S3 lives in the internet. So even though it's within that region, say if it's co-located with your VPC, you are actually leaving your VPC in order to talk to it. So you have to go out something, probably an internet gateway. So looking at these these answers, right away, you will point out, or you'll see how a lot of them say virtual private gateway. Remember, virtual private gateway, as soon as you see virtual private gateway, you should think VPN. Since we're going from your VPC to S3, all three of these answers can be immediately eliminated. So 1, 3, and 4 go away. So now we have 2, 5, and 6 left. Now we know we have to go to the internet to reach S3. So really, it's looking specifically at the differences between 2, 5, and 6. So if you look at those, they all say internet gateway route 0000/0. So that's the CIDR notation for the IP address range to the internet gateway. And then you look at the things coming out of it. So we're talking about security group, ACL, or another security group. And then the difference between that last one is slightly different. So what you can do is you can eliminate the ACL one, because remember with ACLs, they're stateless. So you have to have rules for both directions. If you open an outbound rule and you don't open an inbound rule, the traffic won't come back. So that one can't be right. So now you look at 2 and 6. You look at the difference between 2 and 6. 2 and 6 says I have an elastic IP or I have a VPC assigned internal IP address. So this is where you have to think just a little bit more. If I'm talking to the internet, I'm talking with a public IP address, so it has to be number 2. Tricky, right? There's a lot going on, and this is where it comes down to really reading these kind of thoughtfully and really separating out the differences that are there between those answers. I would say, I think I said this earlier, about a third of the questions are at this very deep analytical level. So hopefully that helps you from a confidence point of view, but you do have to be very thoughtful in picking these apart. There was a question, how did I figure out the access is from internet and not through VPN? It doesn't say VPN in the question stem. The question is, I'm going from a subnet in a VPC to S3, and vice versa. So it's never leaving AWS to go to on-premises. Is virtual gateway the same as VPN? Whenever I see virtual private gateway, I immediately think VPN. Yes. There's a question, so I don't need an outbound ACL for the network. You don't, because by default, the ACL is wide open. If you've looked at network ACLs, they're written like firewall rules in that they're evaluated in an order. And so the first rule is star allow all. So that's what. So that's why sometimes there's a confusion between how those rules work. Network ACLs by default, if you have nothing there, the default rule is allow star. From a security group's point of view, it seems redundant with network ACLs, and to some degree they are. With security groups, you have to allow things specifically. They're denied by default, in other words. Cool. Okay. Let's roll on. Let's talk about securing the data layer. So what we're really talking about here is securing data in transit and securing data at rest. If you've heard those terms, that's how that works. Essentially, securing data in transit is when you're moving things in and out of AWS or between different components in AWS where you are on the public internet. So in the previous example, if you're not using a VPC endpoint and you're going from a VPC to S3, technically you're talking over the internet, even though it stays within that region. So if you have to, for compliance reasons or regulatory reasons, know that that is encrypted in transit or secure in transit, you may have to use security going back and forth. With data at rest, for the most part, it is just checking a box to make things secure. You do have to know a little bit about the mechanics of that with respect to S3 and EBS, so we're going to talk about that. So with data in transit, you want to look at using SSL if you're coming over the web, or using an HTTPS endpoint if that's appropriate. You want to use VPN with IPsec or some tunnel to that respect. You want to use Direct Connect, or you want to use some kind of tool to import and export data and know that it's going to be encrypted in that transit. Furthermore, if you're using the AWS API, that's all HTTPS calls by default, so all of your API calls are secure. With respect to data at rest, you want to have access control be the primary thing, and then furthermore encryption at the level beyond that. So from an access control perspective, you want to leverage IAM policies, bucket policies, access control lists, and temporary credentials, in other words, signed URLs when you're working with S3. So the difference between IAM policies, bucket policies, and access control lists with respect to S3 is contained in a blog entry, which it references here. If you look up that blog entry name, you'll find it. The short form is IAM requires you to be, or the difference between IAM policies and bucket policies is IAM is IAM users, whereas bucket policies can be accounts, and those can be different AWS accounts. So that's how you do cross-account control. And then access control lists are different in that bucket policies and IAM policies live at the kind of bucket level, whereas access control lists can live all the way down to the individual objects. And this is an important distinction. Again, this really just comes down to knowing the differences between them. There may be questions that are there with distracting kinds of answers that say, use a bucket policy on an individual object, and just know that a bucket policy, as it implies in the name, only lives at the bucket level, things like that. So after you get past kind of the access control of the individual objects, you can turn on encryption. Encryption can be server-side or client-side. Furthermore, both server-side and client-side can be managed with keys that the customer controls or ones that AWS controls. With respect to EBS, you can encrypt the volumes that the EC2 instances use as their disks. And again, you can encrypt them with AWS keys, or you can encrypt them with a key that you upload. And it's encrypted at the volume level. So if someone were to somehow gain access to that volume, they wouldn't be able to read it because those keys are specific to each volume. There is one kind of interesting part here, third-party assistance in some database technologies. If you're using one idiosyncrasy about the databases is that normally when you check the box for encryption on a database, it's doing EBS encryption. You're encrypting the data volume that's underlying the database instance. Some database engines, specifically Microsoft SQL and Oracle, they have TDE, transparent data encryption, built in. So if you check that box, then you can get encryption that way rather than encrypting the data volume. So here is a sample question which you can look at. Let's see, your company has confidential information that according to security policies must be stored in an encrypted format. So we're talking about encryption at rest. So which of the following services provide an encryption feature? Okay, this is just one that you have to just know, essentially, but we can walk through it, and there's some things that are related to the services that you might want to write down. So, services that provide encryption by default. So EBS and S3, like we talked about earlier, have encryption. You can just check the boxes, and they will have encryption that's available. EC2 instance store volumes, Redshift, DynamoDB, and Elasticache are the last things that are left. So for a lot of people, this is like, I don't know. There were a couple questions where it was like 1, 2, and I don't know what the other one is. This is where if you know what the services do, it might help you guess. So if you think about encryption, encryption is always going to be counterbalanced by something else. You don't just encrypt for fun. You encrypt because of compliance reasons. You encrypt because of regulatory reasons. So the thing that it balances against is often speed or performance. So if you look at the remaining answers here, EC2 instance store volumes, Redshift, DynamoDB, and Elasticache, which one of those are related to having speed or higher performance? If you look at it that way, EC2 instance store, recall that those are the disks that are on the host, and those are used for very fast IOPS. So that's a performance one. Redshift is data warehousing and queries. DynamoDB is the very fast database table access for NoSQL. So we're talking single-digit milliseconds. That's one of the few services that has an SLA. So that's related to speed. And then Elasticache is for caching data in memory. And so as you can imagine, if it's cached in memory, it's faster if it's unencrypted. So looking at it from that perspective, 3, 5, and 6 are built around speed, whereas Redshift is not built around speed. It's built around very long business intelligence queries. So that has encryption built in. All right, I'm going to scroll back because there were a few questions about things happening earlier. There's a question, it isn't 3. It actually isn't 3. Instance store volumes are meant to be read from and to very, very fast. So as such, it's prioritizing IOPS. Okay, let's go back. There were just a couple questions. There was one regarding do permissions override IAM or bucket policies? I highly recommend that you look at how permissions are applied and how they work. Essentially, the short form is denies always win. They're evaluated as a group, so denies win when you're taking the set of permissions across. And then there was another question. I think people were going back to the question about the security groups, the tricky question about the security groups and the networking. We can look back at that one more time, but I think the important thing to kind of go along with that is that there's kind of a lot of little pieces that are involved, and it's very subtle the differences that are in between. So knowing the differences that are in between are the thing that's going to get you through the test. I believe one of the answers was opening an outbound rule to S3. You're absolutely right. You don't have to open outbound rules to S3 with a security group. So that aspect of it is a distractor in relation to that answer, but that answer of the answers that were left was the one that is right. Let's see. Do EBS volumes, could they be encrypted while the running EC2 instance continues to work? I don't believe we have a question specifically around this. Essentially, you can't change the encryption while the EC2 instance is running. You'd have to stop it. Okay. Let's roll through a little bit more here. We want to secure, if you're securing at the application layer, remember with the shared security model, there's two things that are secure. There's things that AWS secures and things that the customer secures. So the actual application itself lives on the customer side. So that is something that you have to secure. So when we're talking about securing those applications, we want to give you all the tools to do that. So there's different ways to apply those applications, or apply the access control to those. So IAM is possibly available, using operating system controls built into the operating system, such as AD accounts or other accounts that are built into that operating system. Furthermore, individual applications can have accounts as well. So just knowing that there's this continuum of accounts that you may have to delegate permissions to or not, or use to control access to those applications. So what you have to do is essentially have some kind of way to manage those, whether it's federation of your existing Active Directory and then IAM, or keeping them separate in order to control security in a different way. Using secure password storage policies. Again, this is all just stuff that you would be doing, whether it was on-premises or in the cloud anyway. So just knowing what kinds of controls are there. And this really boils down to security just being very important at AWS. That's why that white paper is 90 plus pages long. This is really going to serve you beyond the certification. So hopefully it's stuff you just can keep in mind. So let's roll into a sample question. Which of the following actions can be controlled with an IAM policy? Choose 3. All right, looking good, looking good. A lot of response for this one too. So this, again, we're making the distinction between IAM policies and handling them in some other policy mechanism which you may have in your environment. So that's where this is where this distinction is going to come into play real easy. So here's the first one: creating tables in the RDS database. So creating tables is a database level action. Once you have access to the database, you can create tables however you want. That can't be restricted by IAM, because that's not a AWS API call. That's a database specific call. So you would be doing that through, SQL Workbench or what have you. So that's a database administration kind of action. Number 2 in here, configuring a VPC security group. That sounds like an API call. That sounds like something you would do through the AWS console to build your environment. So let's keep that one. Logging into a .NET application. So .NET as a Microsoft kind of tool is going to have its own set of credentials and application logic. So that is one, again, that is handled outside of AWS. So the other ones, as you can guess, are IAM policy related. Let's just go through them just to be double sure. So creating an Oracle RDS database. So that's creating the database So that's from 0, and that is done through the API or the console. And then creating an Amazon S3 bucket, as you can imagine, that's also an AWS specific kind of action. So those 2, 4, and 5 are the correct answers for this question. Ready for another sample question? Here we go. You want to create a group of Amazon EC2 instances in an application tier subnet that accepts HTTP traffic only from instances in the web tier. A group of instances in a different subnet that are sharing a web tier security group. Which of the following will achieve this? I see some people saying more than one answer. Remember, it doesn't say choose more than one, so there's only one answer to this one. Okay, let's take a look at this one. This is the, let's identify the stem of the question. The main pieces are the application tier and a web tier. So it's a 2-tier application at the very least, and they only want instances in the web tier talking to the application tier. So how do we do this? This first one, add a load balancer to the security group. It sort of sounds like a good idea. We want to decouple our web tier and application tier, but remember, a load balancer doesn't block traffic. Load balancer is made to balance traffic between instances which may be in multiple availability zones, but it doesn't have anything to do with filtering that traffic. So we keep going through here. Another one that is wrong, and it just jumps out as wrong, is the fourth one regarding routing tables. So routing tables don't block traffic either. They say that all traffic or traffic to certain hosts goes through different hosts, but it's not used as a traffic control mechanism to restrict traffic. So we're looking at 2 and 3 here. And now we're at the infamous, like, do I use the security group or do I use a network ACL? So again, knowing the difference between network ACLs and security groups really comes into play here. With security groups, again, they're denied by default, so you have to allow specific port access to kind of come through. And with network ACLs, they are stateless, so you have to specify rules for inbound and outbound. Furthermore, the way network ACL rules are written is that they're evaluated in an order. So they look like this is more familiar to network engineer firewall rules than with security groups, which is an AWS kind of specific context. If I allow using the ACL inbound traffic from the web tier into that application tier, it does not block traffic from other things. It's not built into that rule. So the only way to do that is number 2, where you say the only traffic that it will receive is traffic from this other security group. So what this protects against is if there are instances in the same tier, there's say in that same app tier, can talk to instances in there. So that would not be blocked by a network ACL. It's a very subtle distinction, but in this case, the security groups are more granular in relation to letting traffic come in and out. Just remember, security groups protect groups of instances, whereas network ACLs are based on subnets, and the subnet may be wider or have more things in it than just the application tier that you're worried about. Another sample question here. You have a publicly facing web application where users self-register to sign up for an account. The account shares static objects with authenticated users of your application, and you want to store this content on Amazon S3 and make it available only to properly authorized users over the web. What is the most cost-effective and performant method for achieving this? All right, here's the important pieces of this question. We want the authenticated users, and they're only going to be, we want it to be cost effective and performant. There's a question, can I repeat answers for the previous question? I'll go back after this one. So let's finish this one up first. We want to find the most cost effective and performant method for giving objects to authenticated users of our app. So the important piece of that is that the authentication is happening in the application, and they have to sign up for an account. So if they're coming in from the internet, we're probably not giving them or AWS accounts in order to do that. So you want to look at these kinds of questions and make that decision. If you make that call, then number one goes away because that is related to AWS accounts. Remember, bucket policies are related to accounts. Furthermore, kind of similarly to this, number three, IAM policies, and that assumes they have IAM accounts, and they're not going to have that either. They're application level accounts. So looking at 2 and 4, certainly 4 would work, writing code that reads the objects and then gives them to S3, but that is essentially what signed URLs are, and so you can just use that because that will be more cost effective and performant. There's a question, could it be an IAM account dedicated to an application? The problem with doing that is that, or that they're logging in as, they're all coming in as that same user. They're not getting different keys. So it's, I mean, from an architecture perspective, they could do that, but looking at this, you want it to be secure, so that implies you want different keys for everyone coming in, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, let me go back and then look at that last one because this is actually the last one in this section. Do enough people want to go back and look at the prior question? Okay, let's just go back. Let me go all the way back here. So this is the EC2 instance. Yes, okay. No, yes, no. Okay, how about this? Because some people requested a break as well. Let's come back in 5 minutes. Or let's make it 10. Let's make it 10. So let's come back at in 10 minutes. I'll put the timer back up. But if we go, in the meantime, I'll just talk through this one more time. There's some dissent here. We'll just do this. Let's do a quick 10-minute, and I will talk through this, which will take just 1 more minute. How long do we have for the course? So there are 2 more sections after this, and I would say it's probably 35 to 40 minutes. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. If you do want to stick around for this question, I'll talk through it one more time, but otherwise we will come back. There was a question, are we going to have questions on pillars of security? I don't know the 5 pillars of security, so we don't have a question on that. If you mean pillars of the well-architected framework, that's we don't specifically break those out for the test. So let's talk through this one more time, and I'll put the see if I can put the timer back up without it interfering with me here. So we're going to put this up for, we'll come back in 10. So with this question, I just want to double check on it. So we want to allow only from the web tier to that application tier. So we're looking at the application tier's ACL or security group. We already kind of decided that let's see if I can do this. 1 doesn't work because it's not blocking traffic through the load balancer, and 4 doesn't work because it's not a routing table action. So the only options here are security group or network ACL. When the network ACL is applied, let me go back so you can read it. The network ACL is based on an IP kind of subnet range, and so that implies that everything you want to protect is in that subnet range. And what we're saying here is that we only want instances in the web tier. The problem is if we give a web range that is too wide with the ACL, there's no way to stop that traffic coming through. So the only way to specifically restrict it to the web tier is to encapsulate the web tier within a security group and then allow that traffic into the application tier, with the source being that other security group. That's one of the kind of interesting powers of security groups, is that you don't have to specify an IP address range. You can specify another security group as the source of that traffic. I hope that helps. Okay, so we're going to come back with 8 minutes. I'm going to put up the next set of slides, and we will jump in. And we are back. We're going to do just one more large section regarding the last domain here for troubleshooting. And like I said, troubleshooting is too wide of a topic. It's not something that can easily be condensed into even a multi-day class, let alone the 30, 40 minutes that we're going to have today here. Instead, we're going to look at it with respect to the exam and the kinds of things that you want to be aware of when studying up for the exam. So we're really just going to be talking at a very general level. This is, if you have hands-on experience with working with AWS, you'll probably have run into some of the things that we're looking at. Mostly it's going to be around connectivity, honestly. So let's kind of dive into the different pieces that are here. Like I said, it's mostly related to connectivity and then making sure things come back or can be recovered and knowing how to do that, as well as understanding the idea of service limits in AWS and that there are a combination of soft limits and hard limits within AWS, which may be affecting your ability to kind of build or implement things in AWS. So if you have connectivity issues, really this stems to something with building that VPC. So I will again point it out, knowing all the different parts of how to build the VPC is really key to getting through this test. So the pieces that they have here, the gateways, so knowing how you're reaching that thing that you're reaching, whether that's through the internet gateway or you're coming in over the virtual private gateway and using a VPN. If there are firewall rules coming out of your environment, or if there are firewall rules inside the environment. So we're talking about network ACLs and security groups on the way in, and then if you have firewall rules on your corporate network on the way out, that could also be blocking you potentially. Knowing that how traffic is routing, so maybe you built it correctly, but the traffic isn't routed to the internet gateway, then traffic can't get to your different instances. Having public IPs or elastic IPs, which are static public IPs that persist through an instance stop or start, having those on instances that are meant to be publicly facing. And then, of course, if you have firewalls at the operating system level, knowing that those exist too. So really, connectivity boils down to what are all the pieces between you and the thing you want to talk to, and knowing all the different parts of the VPC are really going to go a long way to knowing what all of those parts are. Going to talk about troubleshooting instances and EBS volumes. They all have kind of a healthiness check that's built in, and so knowing what those healthiness checks refer to is really key for this. So for example, with EC2 instances, when you launch an EC2 instance, sometimes in the row you'll see 2 of 2 checks, and there's a green light. The 2 checks there are an instance check and a host check. The instance check makes sure the instance is up. The host makes sure the underlying physical host that's hosting that virtualized environment is also up. So knowing how When one check fails, what to do is important. With relation to EBS volumes, knowing how to recover them, because EBS is in a separate place, on separate hardware from the EC2 instances, knowing that you can detach volumes from and then reattach them into other EC2 instances, or you can take snapshots of them for backup purposes, things like that. Furthermore, there are limits in AWS. There are a number of soft limits, but there are also some hard limits. If you are trying to launch instances and you run into your limit, you will just get an error, and you may not know why it's launching. It's not specifically that instance; it's that you've reached the limit of instances for that account. The error should be descriptive enough, ideally, so you can see it if you're launching it manually. The issue comes up is if you're launching EC2 instances via auto-scaling, and that auto-scaling is happening behind the scenes, you're not looking at the console when that EC2 instance launches, so you may not get an error that you can see. You might get it in a log later that you can look back at, but there may not be something obvious that's stopping you. Just knowing that there are limits to certain services is the way to figure that out. There's a question, can you explain what it means to attach a volume as data? Let me go back and talk about that. So this is specifically regarding if I have my C drive or my slash partition on my Linux instance is somehow corrupt and it won't boot. No amount of rebooting or stopping and starting that will cause that drive to be readable. But what I could do is detach that volume and then attach it as a D drive or as a slash temp or a slash recover on another EC2 instance, and then I could inspect it to find out what went wrong or use that to take data off of it. Hope that helps. Oh, oops. Getting an error here. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Hope that works. There was a question around backup plans. I'm not sure what that's referring to. Should you do backups? Yes. Do we talk about backups with respect to the exam? No. Or I'm sorry, we do, but only with respect to the services that have backups built in, like RDS, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So like I was saying with limits, there are limits in AWS. If you look up service limits with AWS, you will see a very large list of them. Don't memorize them. You don't have to memorize them. You just have to know that they do exist and they may stop things from launching because they do exist. You can, of course, increase many of those soft limits all the way up to the hard limits that are available. So for example, there's a soft limit for the number of VPCs in your account, and that's 5. So if you want more than 5 VPCs in your account, you can generate a support ticket from within the console or call support, and they'll do that on the back end for you. The reason this says Trusted Advisor is your friend here is if you go to the Trusted Advisor service within the AWS console, you can see your utilization against those limits. So if you want to use that as a way to set alarms, that's a way to do that. I don't like this slide because it has all these limits on here. This is good to know, but you don't need the actual numbers for the exam. So I don't want to spend too much time on it. Just know that there are limits that are in the account. The one that I would say is very common is just that first one, 20 instances per account. It's obviously there are accounts with many more than 20, so they must have gone through the limit increase process. So here's a sample question. Wow, this is a very long question part and a very short answer part. Let's go. You have an existing VPC with a default routing table and several Linux instances running in a single subnet. You want to launch a Windows instance from an Amazon-provided AMI in the same subnet using the same security group. The Windows instance is running, but you can't connect to it via RDP. However, you can connect to the Linux instances via SSH, and from there can ping the Windows instance. So what is the problem? I think we're getting pretty unanimous answers in here, so let's just roll on. It looks pretty good. I think you guys are getting better at reading these questions than I am. So let's look at this. Let's pull out the relevant information. There's some Linux in there, some Windows in there. You can connect to the Linux machines, but not the Windows machines. So when you go through and pop through them, there's some rules that are there. As you can imagine, one would be a problem, right? If you have a Windows firewall rule attached that would block RDP, that would be a problem. But because it's the Amazon provided AMI, that's open by default. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to connect to those Windows machines once you started them. So by default, the Windows AMIs open RDP, and the Linux AMIs open SSH. That's at the OS level. So you still have to configure other things to let that go, and that's one of the things we're talking about in here. So specifically, let's go through the rules again a little bit, or the answers in here a little bit more. A routing rule must be configured to allow RDP traffic. That's not how routing works. Routing is the packet path of traffic originating in the subnet or VPC. A security group must be added to allow RDP traffic. The majority of folks are picking 3, so let's hang on to that one. And or a network ACL rule must be added to allow RDP traffic. So again, by default, the ACL, the network ACL is allow by default. So you have to, but the security groups are deny by default. So you have to open that rule at the at the security group level. This makes sense, right? The security group for this set of machines is probably allow SSH in, and they forgot to allow RDP because they were only expecting to launch Linux instances. Yep, exactly. It's the same security group for both. Cool. Let's look at another sample question here. An Amazon EBS-backed Amazon EC2 instance has failed and is no longer responsive. So critical information exists on that root volume that must be recovered, but all attempts to log into that instance may have failed. An original AMI is available, but no recent backup of the root volume is available. How can the information on this volume be recovered? I think I may have given the answer to this one away too earlier, right? If you were paying attention. All right, this is looking good. Let's highlight the important bits here and then just go through the answers. First one here says terminate the failed Amazon EC2 instance and then recover the Amazon EBS volume. That can't be right because by default, if you terminate an EC2 instance, it deletes the volume that's associated. And if you want to recover that volume, you don't want to delete it. So number 1 can't be right. Number 2 says create a snapshot of the root volume and then launch a new instance from the snapshot. This one is, it sounds like it should be right, but it is also incorrect. There's a very subtle distinction in here because you don't launch instances from snapshots, you launch them from AMIs. So if you created an AMI from that, in that snapshot, possibly you could launch it, but it's very likely, because it is just a snapshot of the data, that it's the same data, so launching it will have the same issue. So 2 is also correct. 3, launch a new instance from the original AMI. When you do that, you get the original AMI. You don't get the volume that you want to recover. So really, the right answer is 4, which we talked about earlier. You would create a new instance and then detach the volume as root from the old instance and attach it as a second volume, a data volume, on the new instance, and you can inspect the volume and hopefully recover your data. Okay, there's a new question here. You've deployed an application in a VPC public subnet, and several identical EC2 application instances are successfully running and are reachable from the internet. You decide to scale up the application by launching another Amazon EC2 instance in the same subnet using the same AMI and security group. However, you find that the new instance can't be reached from the internet. What must be changed to make that new instance reachable from the internet? Okay, this looks good. Looks like you guys are good at troubleshooting. This could be it. So let's identify the main pieces. Essentially, you have a public subnet. You have some EC2 instances that you can get to. You launch a new one, but you can't get to that new one. So there's something funky about that new one. So number 1, deploy a NAT instance into the public subnet. We had a question earlier. Do you need to know NAT or do you need to know bastion hosts? This would be the level that you need to know them. It's like, when are they appropriate in a system? They're only appropriate if you have a private subnet and you're trying to either log into one, so you're using a bastion host or jump box, as they're sometimes called, to log into that private subnet, or you want that private subnet to reach out to the internet, in which case it has to do that through a NAT instance or a NAT gateway. Deploying a NAT instance into a public subnet does not affect anything inside of that public subnet, so 1 is just a distractor. Number 2 here, configuring a public IP address in the guest OS of the new instance. This one's kind of a trick question because you don't actually specify the public IP address in the guest OS. If you're in the guest OS, if you're in Linux and you do an IP config, or you're in Windows and you do an if, or I did it the other way around. Windows, you do an IP config, or Linux, you do an if config. You're going to get the private IP address. The public IP address isn't shown, at least from the operating system point of view, so it's not 2. Number 3, assign an elastic IP address to the new instance. That one sounds pretty good, knowing that elastic IP addresses are public IP addresses. So let's hold on to that one. The 4th one is modifying the routing table for the subnet to allow access to the new instance. Because the existing instances are fine, you don't want to modify the routing table because that would affect everything in that subnet. So it's not 4. The correct answer is then 3. Cool. Oh, we're at the end of that section. That was much faster than I expected. Okay, great. That's good because that means we are ending just a little early. We are in the last section. So thanks everybody for making it all the way through. Let's go through just a few more slides here. We'll talk about kind of next steps and resources, and hopefully we'll get you on your way to passing this exam. So just a reminder, this exam validates your ability to identify and gather requirements in order to define a solution built on AWS with best practices. We want you to be able to provide guidance on architectural best practices to other people in your organization, specifically developers and system administrators, to help build and maintain that environment. There are a lot of use cases of AWS, so we expect as a solutions architect at the associate level, that these are the things you should be able to do. I'm not going to read all of these. I recommend taking a screenshot perhaps, but really this comes down to these are the kinds of domains or kinds of scenarios that these questions are going to come out of. It's going to be related to designing your environment, implementing different parts of it, understanding that there are trade-offs between using different things, understanding that there are constraints around different services, and just knowing how to build that. So I'll give people a second to read through these or screenshot them or write them down as we go, but I'll give you a few minutes or a minute to just go over this. Okay. So as I'd been hinting at, kind of as we go through things, there's two certifications in this track for solutions architect. There's the associate certification and the professional certification. To kind of whet your appetite, the professional certification, it goes further than the associate certification does. It has a lot more more kind of interesting and nuanced looks at the different services, often combining multiple services together in worrying about scenarios around things, because as your experience with AWS grows, you're likely going to encounter and involve more services than just the ones that we talked about today. So more than just EC2 and VPC and RDS and S3, you're probably going to be pulling in multiple services. As you do that, there can be different design patterns and extra pieces that are involved with that. So knowing all of those, but then still coming back to the characteristics of scalability, security, reliability, and cost effectiveness really fits around the professional level certification. I don't have the professional level certification yet. I would like to. I'm still studying for it. I've been told kind of a good kind of gauge for how it works from a time perspective is often a 3 to 6 months experience with AWS can equate to the associate level certification, and then a 6 month to a year and a half is really where the professional certification comes along. There's a question regarding dev and SysOps training. I would have to look at the schedule to know what's available. I don't have the schedule in front of me to know when dev and SysOps trainings like these are being held. So as an example, again, just to overwhelm you with words, this is the professional certification. You want to have all of these use cases, and they're much, much deeper and wider cases that you look at the associate level. Okay, there's a question. Can you see the last slide in the previous section before this future section? I'll have to go back to do that. So I'll do that at the end. There's a question: is it better to go for the Dev and SysOps course or the professional course after taking this? I think if you know what kind of role that you're expecting, more of a design and architecting role versus a more developer kind of role versus a system administrator kind of role, I think that's a clear track. I would recommend taking the certification that is related to that rather than looking at it as a kind of what do I collect kind of thing. The professional certification is much, much wider, as you can see from the previous slide. This one, the we sometimes call these are 100 level certs, and these are like 300 level certs. So you can think of it that way. So I'll jump back up. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but again, if you are considering following this track onto professional, it may be a good idea to have some understanding of programming, more likely scripting, and just understanding from a programming level that the existence of APIs and how you can use them, how SDKs kind of interact, and what those essentially just what that word means, and then how to involve it. Furthermore, for the professional exams, especially, definitely reading those white papers on the different services will go towards passing those exams. This one at the very bottom here, the use of the AWS Architecture Center. I referenced a link for this in the chat. I highly recommend going to it. It's aws.amazon.com/answers. This won't necessarily be useful for the exam, but just as a way to see other architectures and other patterns, I highly recommend it, as it is very solution based and will involve multiple services. It's a very interesting link for those who want to chase that down. So that URL, and I'll type it into the chat. Like many others with AWS, it's aws.amazon.com/the thing that you're looking for. In this case, Answers is the one to go to. Okay, so like I said, 6 months is associate. This actually says 2 years for professional. So you want to think of it from that kind of respect. All right, this is a long page of links, which I will leave up for a very long time because you probably want to pick those up, or I can copy and paste these into the chat. These are the resources that I would recommend. I would recommend going to that first link because that's in the certification link. You can find the exam blueprint for this, as well as a lot of the resources that are specific to this exam. The blueprint is highly recommended because it goes through the domains that we talked about, the 4 different domains of design, implementation, security, and troubleshooting. Furthermore, it goes through and highlights the different services that you have to know that are in those domains. So that is a good, concise, like, this is what I might have to study guide. Furthermore, the self-paced labs are often a good way to get into AWS and get your hands dirty with the console if you don't have access via other means. The nice thing about the self-paced labs there are labs that are specific for certificate preparation, and so it will go through things like, let me walk you through all the pieces of a VPC. Now, I will note that those are I don't believe those are free. There are some that are free, but not all of them are. So if you are willing to invest in that track, that is it's highly recommended that you have some hands-on experience with AWS. There's really no substitute for actually getting into the console and doing that. If you do want to take a formalized course, I teach both a 1-day and a 3-day course for AWS. There's a Technical Essentials course and the Architecting on AWS course. That's a 1-day and a 3-day course. Obviously the 3-day course we go into more depth about everything, but you do get a fair amount of instruction plus hands-on labs as part of those courses. And then, of course, there are the generic descriptions of white papers, architectures, and documentation, which are there. Those can be daunting. If you want to jump in, please reference them with respect to the things that you want to study. I wouldn't go directly into white papers and just start reading white papers. You'll get lost and overwhelmed very quickly. Really, go to that first link, pick up the exam blueprint, find the resources that or the services that you want to study on, or the patterns that you want to study, and then as you need to, kind of supplement that with documentation and white papers and things to that. I'm going to go forward before I go back because we're almost at the end of the decks. So if you want to keep, or if there are slides that you wanted to keep specifically, I will go back, but after we've finished the content. Like I said, there was the exam blueprint. I highly recommend you start there as your guide for studying. There are a few sample questions that are available, and then there's the practice exam. So let me go over the practice exam again, and the link for all three of these are available on that certification site for the Solutions Architect exam. But the practice exam is a $20 fee, and I don't know if that's translated into other currencies, but when you pay that $20 fee, you get 20 questions, and they're just like questions in the exam. In fact, you may see some of those same questions in the exam. When you do that, you will get a score at the end, and it won't tell you exactly what you got wrong, but it will tell you in reference to the problem domains that you have. You cannot pay another $20 and get another 20 questions. You will get the same 20 questions. So I used it as a kind of just check. After I'd done a bunch of studying, I took that test, and when I felt confident that at the score I got, that was kind of a go or no go. But you can essentially only do it once because you have you'll get the same questions if you did it more than once. Let's see. There is further than this, and it doesn't show up on here, and I think it actually doesn't show up in the slides. There is an exam guide which was published by AWS, and that there is only one published exam guide from AWS for an AWS exam, and that's for this exam, for the Solutions Architect Associate exam. I believe it's I don't have the price off the top of my head. I would have to look it up, but it's available on Amazon.com, of course, or through other sellers. It is available as a physical book or as a Kindle book. The nice thing about this exam is because it is the only study guide that we have produced, the only printed study guide we've produced. It's very good. I used it to help study for my exam, and in addition to the training that I'd gotten beforehand, I think it was instrumental in me passing. I would recommend the paperback versus the Kindle version, only because it does have a lot of sample questions similar to this, but it's harder to hold the question and then flip to where the answer is in a Kindle than it is with your fingers. That's just me. It is sort of older, so there will be new questions beyond that. Plus, it will have some because the test does change. There have been some things that have been deprecated out of that book. The nice thing is that those questions just won't appear if they're not there. So it's not like you're studying things that, or you're not going to be catching stuff. It's more likely that you will know more than less coming in, because we do add questions slower than we take them out of the content. So I believe, let me just check in here one more time. This is the how to register for the exam. Essentially, if you go to that certification website, aws.training, and then go to certification, and you can pick the exam right out of there to schedule, and it's similar to what we talked about. I don't think there's a lot more to say about that. In fact, we have reached the end of the content. So I want to first thank you all for sticking with me for 3.5 hours to get through all of this content. I I want to, reiterate that this is um, a way to prep for the exam, but it is not the prep for the exam. So I hope no one has gone out and scheduled a test for, half an hour from now to go pass it. If you do, that's wonderful. But this is really meant to be a jumping off point to get you into what you have to study to really focus on. If you've been in AWS and you have some experience, it helps you kind of get a good breadth of what are the different pieces that you have to study. Plus, I hope it gave you a good flavor for how the questions feel and how analytical you have to be about them, and what kinds of questions you come out. So what I want to do right now is give people kind of an opportunity to ask any further questions that you may have, and I will go back a few slides. I'm not sure exactly which slides people needed, but I'll go back to figure out which slides people wanted to take screenshots of. So thank you. Okay, there was one. There was a request for associate versus professional. I'll put this one up. Not sure if it was this one or. Last sample question. Okay, we'll go back to the last sample question. Okay, let's go back to the last sample question. So that was in a different module, so let me pop out of this. This is the last sample question. So someone asked me if the exam is scheduled in 2 days, how do I utilize those last 2 days? Really just go over all the different services in the exam blueprint that are related to the test and just go through. And if you have access to a console, fire up all of those things. Just build a VPC, launch an EC2 instance, pick up a volume and remove it from one and put it onto another. Just things to reinforce the different pieces that are involved. There's another question of the 3-day and the 1-day. Will those provide hands-on experience? They absolutely do. The 1-day technical essentials class has has 4 labs associated with it, and the 3-day class has 5 of them, but you spend a lot longer on the labs because they're a lot more in depth. Let's see. Another question. Link for testing. Oh yes, it's a good note from Reginald. If you want, you can sign up for AWS with a credit card, but there is the free tier, which allows you access to many of the AWS services at no cost for a year. I don't know if that's enough to necessarily get into a lot of the content, because you can't do certain things like launching RDS in multi-AZ mode, for example. You can only launch one database instance at once under the free tier, but it might be worth looking into. There's a question, are those classes paid for? Yes, they are. There's a question, what course or certification would be best for a business analyst? I'm not sure of the business analyst role, but there is a business essentials class, which is a 1-day class that goes over a lot of the AWS services from a cost benefit kind of perspective, and how that kind of affects TCO of an IT organization. That might be helpful. I'm not sure if that's something that works for you. There's a question about kind of new questions on the test and how those are worked in. Uh, they are um, they are often tested at different levels. So when I took my test, I was offered to take the regular test or a beta test, and the beta test had, I think, 45 extra questions. So they gave me an extra hour to do the test. It was a very long test, but I was scored on the questions that were live, that were in production, and all the beta questions went into a different analysis pool for inclusion into the test. What is the big data specialty exam? So there is an exam. We have two, or actually probably more than two now, specialty exams for different things. We have one for big data. So if you are working with um, uh, any of the big data services in AWS, that is an exam specifically for that. Last slide in the previous section before the wrap up. Oh, the incentive for taking the beta test is that it's cheaper. So instead of being whatever the price was, I think they cut a third of the price off because it was the beta test. All right, let me go back to see if I can get Frank's question. So the last slide in the previous section before the last section. There's a question, are the tests dynamic? So if you miss a question in one area, does it drill you over and over in that content area? We do not do that. I've seen that in certain exams, but not that one. So, Frank, I'm not sure which question or which slide you meant, so I will roll up to that one. All training, there's a question about how to get training. All training is available at aws.training. Make that URL super easy. And I put that in the chat, so if you want to pick that up. I'm sorry, Frank, if you want to give me 3 more slides, says Devon. Does that help? Did you know which questions were beta when taking the beta test? No, I did not. I had a guess, but not really. I mean, we try not to make them like super gotcha questions about new services. They have to go through a pretty heavy vetting process before they become questions on the tests. Is there a security specific certification? Yes, there is now, I believe. Right before wrap up and future. Let me see. So wrap up and future was this. So do you mean the prior section, Frank? Yeah, okay. So the prior section was a sample question. So it was most likely this sample question? Or do you mean the last slide before the sample question? Let's see. Oh, there's not a slide after that. The next section title slide is the copyright slide. Okay, there was a question from Johan. Recap the important points at the end before closing. I actually thought I did that, but let me kind of run through again. Let me just pop up the first section and really kind of highlight that. So in terms of important points, Johan, I'm not sure if you had specific kinds of things you were looking for, but really the thing boils down to knowing that there are 4 kinds of sections of where the questions come from: architecture, implementation, security, and troubleshooting, and then knowing the breakdown of where those questions kind of flow from. So there's 60% from design, 10% from implementation and deployment, 20% from security, and 10% from troubleshooting. Is EFS and ECS covered on the test? Not to my knowledge. There's a question for further training. So all AWS training you can get from this URL. I put it into the chat, aws.training. Just pop that into your browser and you should be able to find AWS delivered training as well as training delivered through our training partners. There is, of course, training that is outside of AWS, but I don't tend to promote those. There's a question. It seems like VPC is the most critical area. I absolutely agree. Knowing how, not so much knowing everything about a VPC, but VPC touches so many of the different domains, and knowing all the parts of what it is to build a VPC is really, it's going to go a long way towards getting you a passing score. Question of VPC peering. You have to know that you can do it and what the constraints are around it. You don't have to know how to implement it necessarily, other than you have to create a VPC peering target, and then the VPCs have to be in the same region. You can't have overlapping IP space. There's things like that. Does the lab allow us VPC and other configurations? Yes, you will be doing labs, specifically for VPC. Is the 3-day course delivered online or live? I only deliver it live. I believe there are VILT deliveries of the 3-day course, but I don't know the scheduling. I'd have to look at the scheduling page for that. There's a question regarding how many times can you take the test before you have to wait a year? I'll have to look that up. Let's see if I can do that without disrupting the page here. There's a question, how long can you wait after you pass the AWS CSA? I'm actually not sure what that's referring to. So I'll wait for Alexandra to give me more information. Is there any scenario type of questions for VPC to understand the VPC implementation? I would recommend doing the self-paced labs regarding VPC. I know that there is one specifically under the subheading of certification prep, which is essentially just building a VPC from scratch. I don't know if there's documentation regarding that. There might be a documentation walkthrough, but I think doing the labs or doing it in your own account is a better way to do that. So someone asked, how many times can you take the exam again? The FAQ that I've found says that you have to wait 14 days before you have to take it again if you've failed it once. There does not appear to be a limit on the number of times you can take it. So if you fail, you can take it again 14 days from that day. There's a question about how much the exam costs. I would have to look that up. I don't know that one right off the top of my head. Let me see. The exam cost is $150. If you do not pass, do you pay for the full price of the next attempt? Yes, you do. Is AWS going to do this training more often? I hope so. All of these sessions are hopefully scheduled on the AWS training webpage. So if you go to, again, aws.training, you should be able to see them. So this is aws.training. Find training, enroll in training. Under here is your training catalog, and hopefully that gives you the links. Someone's asking, are you sure you don't have to wait a year if you fail 3 times? I am not sure. I don't think that's the case, but I am not sure. There's a question, are there benefits to scoring high? No, a pass is a pass. The 3-day class I teach is architecting on AWS. There's also, in line with the certifications, developing on AWS and system operations on AWS. Can you clarify what you said? The dev exam is not actually coding in or for AWS. Did I hear that wrong? That is sort of right. I mean, you should have some hands-on time with it, but it's more understanding the operation of the API and operation of of the different services and what you can call from the API. I don't believe there are specific code questions, like they're not going to have you look at a Python block and then type it out or tell you which implementation is correct, but it will have very detailed questions about the API calls that you might make. So what are the different things you need to know in order to set up an EC2 instance programmatically, things like that. Okay, questions are slowing down a little bit. There's, like I said, the content is over, so thank you for coming through. I'll stick around for just a little bit more to answer any more questions that people have. But for the most part, again, thank you for coming around and sticking around for this class.